welcome to 1 year later, the benefits of Go Live, what I only wish I knew. If this is not the flight you're expecting, please exit through the rear doors as the hatch is closing and we're getting ready for takeoff. Okay? And you're probably all going to hear that at some point today or tomorrow as you're heading out to your different locations. Just by a show of hands, how many people are not local? I mean, from other places, other countries? Okay, that includes myself. I'm from Philadelphia, so you know we're all in kind of the same boat, and hopefully it's a great travel day, and we'll all get home very safely. So I'm going to be the moderator today. My name is Gary Singh. I'm with Salesforce.com. I'm a principal architect and a call center service and support specialist, and I'll be moderating the track today. When you go in, and hopefully you'll do this, and you take the survey of how well we did on our session today. I believe the session code is SBC 007, so it shouldn't be that hard to remember. 007. I always like that three-number acronym. You know, I always think of James Bond, so just think of that. So now, if you've been at any sessions and if you've been at the keynotes, you know that we need to say that talk about the safe harbor, and there may be some forward-looking statements made today. I think we're going to be doing a fair amount of backward-looking and seeing what was done. So, but just in case there is, and you need to maybe read this further, it is available on our website, and please go out and look at it if you think you need to. So the agenda for this morning is really pretty simple. I mean, we're going to have two very interesting professionals that come from some very interesting companies that have gone through the implementation cycles for Salesforce.com. And we're going to talk about how they approach the Go Live. What are some of the lessons that they learned and some of the words to live by, and how they used testing and training to get where they are today. And what were some of the things that they planned, and what are some of the things that they can tell us about getting ready to go for that implementation. And again, what were the lessons learned, and hopefully you'll get some of the expertise that they have to offer, because they've been there and they've done that. And if you're getting ready to implement, or you're in the process of implementing Salesforce.com, I think they've got some really good advice for you, and some things that they've learned, and things that they've noticed, and things that you ought to take note of, and you'll be able to use in your implementation as well. And then what's next? What are they looking at doing? And what is the next for their organizations? And what are the things that they think they can use Salesforce.com for to help their organizations and go forward into the future? Our speakers today are Karen Hollinger from Avalon Bay. She's Vice President of Operations at Avalon Bay. And Alnor Ladakh from InnovaPost. And they'll be here. They'll each do a portion of the presentation, and then we'll come back and we'll have an opportunity to ask each of them some questions, and we'll do some wrap-up. Okay? At any time, if there are questions that you have as we go along, please don't hesitate. We'll do our best to answer those questions. So I'd like to now introduce Karen Hollinger, Vice President of Operations at Avalon Bay.
So while we get this keyed up, I'll just talk a little bit about Avalon Bay. Avalon Bay is a multifamily real estate firm. We own about 51,000 apartment homes around the United States. We have several apartment communities in San Francisco, including Mission Bay, which is just down the street. It's a beautiful property. We build them. We own the land. We own the properties. We construct them, and we manage them, and then sometimes we sell them. And so this was a really big project for us, for Salesforce, because what we decided to do was centralize our back office operations in Virginia Beach, Virginia. So I guess traditionally, when you have an apartment community, most of the administration, taking rent payments, doing accounting, accounts payable, a lot of the administration actually occurs at the community. and that is the traditional model, and it's still really 95% of apartment communities operate that way. We decided that it was time to actually centralize that, and it sounds like, you know, it's exciting for us and everyone in this room. We go, well, yeah, kind of. Like, what took you so long? But a brick and mortar organization is a little bit slower to embrace centralization. So about 2 years ago, we started the Shared Service Center, and we purchased Salesforce. And I will tell you that it's one of the best purchases I made with the least information. So typically we have, you know, really sort of a leap of faith, actually. You know, typically we spend 6 months and we have committees and we go through and everyone has a say and there's requirements and we do design sessions before we even sign the contract, and then we purchase a solution. And this was not that. This was pretty much deciding that we were going to open this operation in late summer, about 2 years ago. And maybe we should have some way to answer our phone calls that are going to be coming in very quickly and record our interactions. And we did a very quick, basically the CRM magazine top 5 CRMs. And they all came in, like, I think on a Thursday, and by Monday we had narrowed it to 2. We did best and finals. And very quickly, I would say, you know, it says here 3 months. We were probably operational in 6 weeks. It was very, very quick. And so it's done well for us. We've integrated with Cisco. We've integrated with our property management system. We've integrated with Lotus Notes. And we'll just keep integrating. So what did we find good, bad, and ugly? You know, first off, I'll skip to the bottom. There was no real ugly. And I kept waiting for the shoe to drop, and it didn't. And I kept waiting and thinking, my gosh, I didn't really do very good due diligence. So at some point, someone's going to tell me that I picked the wrong solution for 500 licenses. But it didn't actually happen. And 2 years later, I can say, I think, you know, there's no more shoes out there that are going to drop on my head someday. But probably the best thing we did that I didn't want to spend money on was get a good consultant up front to design a good account structure. And so that was something. We had everyone in the room, and we had a Salesforce consultant, and she spent 3 days talking to us about our business. And it felt very, very like wasted time, because we know our business, and why do I have to train you on my business? And how does this help me get my system up? But she spent 3 days with us talking about the business, and she designed a skeleton for our account structure that still exists today. So as I've talked to other Salesforce clients in the last few days, I've heard, you know, sometimes problems with an account structure that didn't later meet your needs, and then you had to go back and do a little redesigning. And we have not had to do that. So it was a great 3 days in retrospect for consulting. We did have, we had one consultant with us for about another 4 weeks to get us operational. And then past that, we really haven't used much consulting, just a little here and a little there for some coding that our internal folks don't feel real strong about. You know, I would say that it still is a shift in our organization. We have a traditional IT function. This is probably one of the only applications in the cloud. And I kind of did this a little bit behind the scenes. You know, I kind of purchased this and said, listen, you know, just don't worry about me. I got this. You know, I'm going to need some help with some interfaces, but I got this. And, you know, I still hear 2 years later, when are you going to be done? And it's this really funny question. When are you going to be done? And I keep saying, I'm not, and I'm never going to be done. And they go, but I don't understand. You know, didn't you have a good project plan? Well, yeah, the project plan was to design these processes, and they were up in 6 weeks. But now we're actually automating, and we're making it easier. And what used to take 1,000 transactions is now going to take 1 transaction and a little bit of coding up front. So, you know, you really never stop deploying, and that would be something that I would recommend. Setting that expectation up front, that there is no such thing as an end. It was very easy to train. In fact, we've spent almost no money on training. And because of the baby steps, we roll out little things. We do little webinars. we have someone that feels strongly about it. They're not a trainer. Go through it, take a little online survey at the end. Did you understand it? Do a little auditing a month later. It's fine. They get it. It's intuitive. The reporting is great. So, we are a shop that typically has people who are designed or designated as reporting analysts. They do the reporting for you, and you submit, requests, and then 6 weeks later you get a draft, and 12 weeks later you get your final version of your report. And I design my own reports. So I'm glad to say that, with about an hour or two of fiddling around, that I can get there and design whatever I need. The bad, I would say interfaces were trickier. That's where I didn't budget money for consulting, or I budgeted a little bit, and the interfaces were much trickier than I think we expected. So we did probably spend a couple weeks on interfaces, but how can you complain? It's a couple weeks of consulting compared to what we're used to. We really didn't budget anyone for internal support. We kind of budgeted, someone to help us with the interfaces and someone to help us with a little configuration. And we probably are on a steady state, at least half an FTE, if not a full FTE. And that was not in my ROI. Because, during the sales process, it's so simple. You don't have to maintain it. We'll take care of it for you. Well, that's true, but you really do need someone. And we also didn't expect to purchase the sandbox. So if you haven't purchased Salesforce yet, that would be one of the small things that I would kvetch about, is that no one told me that I needed a sandbox, but then we're a real development shop, so we're not going to just put things into production. So how do I test this? And you need a sandbox. Okay, well, how much is that? And there really wasn't any ugly. Again, there's really no such thing as a post-go live. You just keep enhancing the system. In the last 3 days, I have written 3 pages of things that other people have done that I'm like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think of that before? We're still doing that. We're still touching that transaction. How silly of us. So we're going to go back and do a lot of changes. I would have also expanded the number of people who were trained in Salesforce. I think we trained one person for 2 days. I probably would have budgeted, for 3 people for a total of 5 to 6 days of training, just so I could spread out that knowledge and not have to, they could have really gone a lot faster with continuous improvement if they had had training, particularly a functional user, which I don't think I would have done at that point, even if I had the training dollars, but I would do now. And in fact, I am doing now. I have a functional person with me for this week to train. And, I'd say consulting has been, expensive. We have so much demand. The lists just keep coming out. So if anyone knows, some dude in his basement in Iowa who wants to work from home, I got a gig for him. And licensing has been costly for us for non-essential users. So we have about 500 licenses. And about 200 of those licenses only touch Salesforce 10 to 20 minutes a week. And that's been very costly. And so, we're trying to figure out ways where maybe we could push reports to them rather than going to Salesforce to try to save on that license cost. And we did design an online tool. I don't know, my T&D department designed it, but they bought this little cheapy tool where they can embed Salesforce and have people train. So now when we roll out a new function, we don't even do the webinar anymore. We just push out a URL, and then when you're done, you have to take a test, and now you're trained, and it reminds you and things like that. And I think it was maybe a $1,000 tool, and it takes someone a couple days to design it. So again, I'd spend more money on training. I'd spend more time on blue sky planning. We continue to find that we don't know what we don't know. It just amazes me. We think we've done a great job. We got this up quickly. It works very well for us. But I'll tell you, I was, in the other presentations for the last few days, I was kind of salivating, like, oh my gosh, all the things that I could do. So I think I probably would force teams of people to spend time just thinking outside the box, just looking at what other companies have done, and just saying, like, what if? Like, and really, I don't want to call it process mapping, because process mapping, I think, has a negative connotation, and consultants come in and they take over your offices. But simply just watching what people do and say, why do you click that 20 times a day? Well, because this is how I do it. Instead, would you rather that email just go out automatically if this condition exists? Oh my gosh, that would be amazing. So we really haven't had as much time as I'd like to do really blue sky planning, but we're now forcing ourselves to do it, and we're smarter with what Salesforce can do now. And I also, we use it for back office. We don't use it for sales at all, which is something that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But that, that's not altogether great. It works fabulous for the function that we have it for, but, we're 500 licenses a year, which is a pretty significant expense when it's not actually producing any, it's producing expense reduction, but not actually any revenue lift. So that's where our 2010 function, or 2010 goal will be. One thing that we didn't plan for that's worked out really well is getting our third parties into Salesforce, into our Salesforce instance, because we have attorneys all around the nation. We're real estate, and those attorneys would send us an email on the development deal that they were working on, and we found ourselves slowly but surely tracking more real estate related things, legal related things in Salesforce, and then we were copying and pasting. We were saying, don't forget to log the email, don't forget to log the call, and there you just start, all of a sudden you go like, why am I doing this? And so now we have our attorneys, most of them, we have attorneys all around the nation, but we have most of our attorneys now in our instance of Salesforce. So they log, we've taught the attorneys who do not work for us to log things in Salesforce, open a follow-up task for the person who needs to know, actually do some basic transactions that we were then keying, but they're the first line of knowledge. And to the point now where some of the attorneys are asking for BlackBerry access so they can be in court and updating, what the judge has said, which, even for our attorneys who are not technically savvy, I'll let you know, they love it, right? And so we just took out a whole function of work by having our third parties actually input data for us. So we're going to continue that theme with a lot of other third parties. We're adding additional back office operations. And then the really big thing for us is going to be using this, again, revenue generating for leasing. So there was a sitcom, the way to explain what we really want to do is there was a sitcom 2 or 3 years ago. There's these two sisters, they live together. They get into an argument, and they go to bed mad. The next morning, the one sister says, I'm moving out. And the other sister says, you can't do that. Where are you going to go? And she goes, well, after we argued, I went on last night. I had my credit run. I picked an apartment. I scheduled a moving truck. I signed my lease. And I'm picking up the keys at 10 o'clock this morning. So there, she snubs her nose at her. That's basically what we want to do. We want to move to, pick your apartment, move it into the cart. This is the view from your apartment, and if you want a 2-bedroom and you want pets, and that generates a lease, or that generates an application, and you know your social, and I don't want to know it. So you run it yourself, and then I will take all those transactions out of the mix, and have probably perfect data as a result, because you know your social better than me keying it. And then the online lease, and we'll use revenue management tools to determine what the pricing is. So that's what's next for us, and I'm out of time.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So our next presenter will be Eleanor Ladakh, Lead Director of Solutions Delivery at InnovaPost in Canada. Eleanor?
Thanks a lot, Gary. So InnovaPost is an IT services, professional services firm up in Canada. We focus primarily on the transportation, logistics, shipping industries. And we were involved in a large project, contact center renewal project for our customer, which is Purolator Courier. They're like the UPS in Canada. They own a big part of the market share of the courier industry in Canada. Their contact center is basically taking about 40,000 calls a day, so it's pretty large implementation. And was running on a legacy system that has been around with a few tertiary applications for close to 20 years, client-server environment. So basically had to replace a lot of those kind of applications with Salesforce.com. We're probably, this is not the subject of the talk today, but the biggest reason why they decided to move into the cloud was not specifically for the cloud itself, even though it's very cool technology to be in right now, but really the economics just made sense, you know, when you looked at it from the capital investment that they would have had to make in the infrastructure to move all those legacy applications out into a new set of tools. This just made so much more sense to do. So basically, in terms of what we looked at up front, I think take advantage of the platform. It comes with a tremendous amount of stuff that's out of the box. And being a custom development shop, you know, there's always that desire to go and write code, right? And really this platform really allows you to do that if you need to, but you don't have to. There's a lot of stuff out of the box that you can use. So to really get the value out of the licensing, take a look at that, because that will reap benefits as you go forward. As with every platform, it does have its nuances, its parameters, and it's important, I think echoing what Karen said, you got to have the right people up front who have deep knowledge of the platform, because that pays itself back immensely as you go through the project. Because when you make mistakes and then having to go back later on and fix them can be very costly. It's important to understand what you want to achieve out of the project, right? So it's completely different when you're trying to just take a legacy system and port it as is into this new cloud platform, as opposed to looking at your processes and then figuring out you know, what your new processes are going to be, how much more efficiency you're going to bring into it. Because not only is the platform very different, you do have to understand clearly upfront that if you are getting into process re-engineering, you do need very clear requirements, and you need to understand what your end state is going to be. And I think Salesforce lends itself quite well to that, because it allows you to go through that iterative design process. So we certainly took as much advantage of that as we could. In our case, because it's an order-taking system, you know, customers calling in essentially need a pickup scheduled, and a courier is supposed to magically show up at their doorstep to pick up a package. So it's a very, there are a lot of the transactions are very time sensitive. So we really needed to understand that when you're moving from a client-server application with a thick client on a desktop out into the cloud, you know, the individual transaction steps may be longer, but what you need to focus is on the end-to-end. And that's very important, because you want to make sure you know what you are measuring yourself against, because if you don't measure it, you're not going to achieve it. And lastly, understanding the cloud computing model. I think for us, being a large IT company, this was really our first big foray into cloud computing, and it is a different medium. It's very different from client server. You know, your data is now traveling out over the cloud, so you need to be careful about that. Security is a big thing. Network latency, especially in our case, because there's a lot of integration taking place with back office systems. And so, you know, now you're integrating with a system in the cloud. In the old days, you would integrate between two systems that are sitting right next to each other in your data center. Very different. So those are some of the things that you need to be aware of from a design perspective. In terms of modeling, we found the GUI-based approach to be very good. It's very iterative, very flexible. But really, when you get into areas such as you know, customization and integration, that's not enough. You need to take a more holistic approach. So in our case, we had to make sure that we looked at the data model carefully, and you do need to put priority and emphasis on the data model upfront, especially when you're integrating, because the ability to change, although it does exist, as you go through the project and you move down the cycle, it becomes a lot more expensive and difficult to do that because you have to go back and change a lot of things. So it's an important investment that if you make upfront, will pay for itself. In our case, it was a big integration project, right? Because we had to integrate a lot of what happens in the contact center into the back office. More importantly, Purolator wanted to achieve two other objectives as part of this project. Number one, they wanted to make sure that it was multi-channel enabled. So the experience that a customer had coming into the contact center, they were able to get through the IVR, and more importantly on the web, because they wanted this to become part of their deflection strategy. So it's important that the customer had a very identical experience no matter what channel they came in on. Secondly, they wanted to make sure that they had a 360 view of the customer. So if a customer went in over a web, scheduled an order for a pickup, and if the courier for whatever reason didn't show up, and the customer then called into the contact center, it was important that the contact center be able to understand what the customer has done. In fact, identify the customer up front just through the phone number so that it pops up automatically, and then be able to understand what orders the customer has processed through the web and be able to provide the level of customer service that they wanted. So those were two additional objectives that were rolled into the project, which made our integration piece a bit more bigger. Now, that said, you're integrating into the cloud, as I said earlier. So there are issues that you need to take into account. For example, how the interfaces will work. In this particular case, you get an API from Salesforce. In the old days, you probably had two systems that you integrated with each other that you had complete control over. In this case, you're now integrating with an API that's out on the cloud, and you need to make your stuff work with it. And that's easier said than done. We had some challenges in those areas, but it's very doable. You just need the right level of expertise, and you need to build it into your design processes up front. In our case, we did have significant requirements for asynchronous processing. For some reasons, they didn't really measure up to what we wanted to do, so we had to kind of move that back through batch updates into our organization and then process it on the back end. I know this is one of the areas Salesforce is looking at, so hopefully that gets better as we go along and that will become less of an issue. Configuration over code. That's the million-dollar debate. But seriously, this platform certainly lends itself very well to configuration. Having said that, you do come into areas where you do need to customize. As part of a large organization where you're integrating with different systems outside of the cloud, outside of Salesforce, you're bound to have areas where you're going to have to write code. But with the Force.com platform now, that's becoming a lot easier. That capability is becoming better. So over time, I expect this to become an area that's going to be even easier to work with. Performance, in our case, this was a really, really big deal because as the orders come in, it's a very dynamic, fluid environment, and in a matter of seconds, that particular order needed to show up on the courier's mobile device. And we are literally talking about a matter of seconds because it's a very fast-moving, dynamic environment. You're doing thousands of transactions a day. So for us, performance benchmarking was important. We needed to get that right. And you do need to take that into account in your design, in fact, quite significantly. Very honestly, we did have to go back a couple of times and rejig some of the things that we did to make sure that we were able to make it work the way we wanted. And again, that comes with every platform, every technology you work with. Just moving it into the cloud on its own is not a panacea for all your problems. But it does have the capability to stand up and process large volume transactions in a high-pitched environment, which is what we ended up doing. You got to be careful with some things like object history. They tend to get really large and can slow down the performance of those particular objects or processes as the case may be. Indexing is important when you're dealing with large volumes. Typically, this gets taken care of by Salesforce. You don't need to worry about it too much. But in some specific cases, you do need to deploy custom indexes. And again, you can work with Salesforce. They do have a process to enable this. So you can work with them to implement the custom indexes that you need. But it's a process, so you need to know how that works. You need to set aside time to do that, but it does happen. Again, from a speed perspective, you do need to build encoding techniques such as caching, not going back to the databases as often as you would like to, minimize that, and that all contributes to the efficiency and the speed of the transactions. Understanding how the end-to-end transaction works, and we found that this was an area that generated a lot of discussion and debate with the business users. Because you're dealing with users who've been in a client-server environment for so long, they're in many ways used to instant responses from the server, right? And cloud computing is very different, right? The transactions taking place over the cloud, it's interfacing with other systems, the transactions take longer. So you need to focus on the end-to-end transaction. And what we found was that rather than focusing on the individual steps, when you focus on the end-to-end transaction, you can actually get it to be very comparable. May not be completely identical, but you can get it to be very comparable. The last point I wanted to make here on this slide was about networking. So depending on the state of your organizations, in our particular case with this particular customer, we knew going in that the network infrastructure was not ready, was not at a state where it would be able to support an application in the cloud. So they had a good internal network, but the pipes leading out into the internet were not where they needed to be. This is a big problem to solve in large organizations because you get the telcos involved, there are third parties involved. If you have a data center provider, they get involved, so on and so forth. So the earlier you recognize that, the better. In our case, what we found was that we had to deal with this issue for the life of the project. So if we wouldn't have started earlier, I don't think we would have been able to deploy successfully. Also, it's very key to cloud computing because no matter how good an application, you could have the best application in the world, but if you don't have the network to support it, you're not going to be successful, right? So in our case, that was a very big part of our project in terms of the influence that it had on the project. And so dealing with that earlier and making sure that there was a focus on it throughout the project certainly helped us a lot. Going live, it was an interesting experience in our case because being an IT company that's been around for many years, having built many large systems, we've had experience with both, going big bang and going pilot. In this particular case, what we determined was because of the potential operational impact that we would have on the order-taking system capability of Purelator, it just didn't make sense for us to go big bang. So we actually kept the legacy system alive during the pilot phase, and we actually went live with a pilot group. And what we found was that was a very smart decision for us because in our case, and I don't know if some of you were here yesterday in this same room, we had a couple of other companies presenting their call center applications, and I think the large implementation experiences were similar. There is an initial hit on productivity. So it's going to take the agents longer to learn the new system, getting up to speed. So you are going to take a significant hit on productivity. But it comes down, and it comes down quite fast. We're now looking at times that agents are working on individual transactions are either the same or even better in some cases. So the productivity does come around. But initially, you will take a hit. What we also found was it allows you to leverage some of the strengths of the platform, which is it allows you to iterate. So it doesn't have to be totally perfect when you put it out there. You can iterate whilst you're in production and make sure you understand how it's behaving in production, what the experiences are, rectify those where required, and then essentially roll it out to the larger group. So in our case, the rollout happened over a 3 to 4 week period, and it's been out there for a few months now, and it's working fine. Deployment is a fairly manual activity today, and those of you who were at some of the other larger sessions heard an announcement in that regard. Salesforce is working to address that, but today it is fairly manual. And our experience was you almost needed a dedicated individual for deployment. So we have a concept of a build master that worked really well for us, and it's one of the things that you need to be aware of. You know, when you move into these new kind of platforms and the business gets a taste of how easy it is to make changes, they start putting their demands on the table. And that's really good, right? Because that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to, you know, create better business, create more efficiencies in the business. But at the end of the day, you know, when you're working within the confines of a large organization where there's integration with other processes, other systems, you do need to maintain the change management discipline. Because if you get away from it, you know, you sometimes run into problems. So it's easier to make changes. You can push them out with the press of a button, and that's the power of the platform. But you do need to maintain that change management discipline. We also found, you know, the administrative functions, it's good to maintain a balance. There are certain things that the business users can do. There are other things that they probably shouldn't be doing because of the impacts of what they can generate as a result of the changes they're making. So how do you find that balance? Well, it's a learning experience. You learn as you go along, and I'm sure based on your individual organizations, you'll figure out what the balance is. So the system's pretty much been out for a few months now. It's working really well. It's been rolled out nationally. Everybody is on there. The old system's pretty much not being used anymore, and it's going to be decommissioned shortly. We've put out a couple of iterations of large changes to it, and we are continuing to enhance it because that's one of the things the platform does really well. In terms of our next steps, we're now looking at working with Purelator to move some other applications into the cloud. They are actually starting on a big Salesforce automation project with us. So overall, it's been a successful implementation, but it's good to be aware of you know, things that I mentioned about if you are going to have an implementation that's fairly large in order for that to be successful. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elnor. So just to be clear, the presentation and the PowerPoints will be available along with the audio on your attendee portal. So you'll get all the slides and everything that goes with that. And that goes for all the sessions as well. So just want to make you aware of that. So just to kind of recap what we heard this morning, we heard Karen talk about how flexibility was really one of the things that was highest on her list, and how well and how pleased she was with Salesforce being able to handle the flexibility and the things that she was trying to accomplish within her organization. And one of the things that I took away was that she spent some time with a consultant, just 3 days really, right up front to kind of, you know, get a foundation for her implementation, kind of learning from that consultant. And I think she said that was probably some of the best time that she spent. And once that foundation was laid, she really didn't have to go back and re-implement anything. I mean, you know, she may have to go and modify and make things, you know, add a few things here and there. But, you know, as far as re-implementation, that 3 days really laid that foundation that was very critical for her organization. And I think we heard both from Elnor and Karen that the iterative approach that Salesforce lends itself so well to, of getting, you know, kind of value very quickly, you know, out of the system, and providing your users with value that they can use immediately versus and you know, I don't know how many have been around as long as I have, but in the mainframe and client server worlds, and Elnor spoke to this, is that the big bang approach is no longer something that people will put up with. You know, no longer will people put up with waiting 6, 12, 18 months sometimes, you know, to see what they want to get out of the system. Because in this day and age, things are changing so rapidly. They need to get business value immediately, and we've heard from both of them. That's really something that the cloud platform really does very well. one of the things that Eleanor, and I think both Karen and Eleanor said was, take advantage of the out-of-the-box solution. There's a lot there. And I think just spending some time up front, like Karen did, to understand what's out of the box and use that out of the box and see what it can do for you is very important, and very much different than a client-server environment that you really have to if you don't see it immediately with using client-server, it's very difficult to go back and take advantage of it. But still, taking advantage of out of the box, understanding it up front, and both of them said that cloud computing in the Service Cloud is really very different than client server, and you have to maybe think about it a little more. And it's really a phenomenal, as you've probably heard during the conference, it's a really phenomenal platform, and people are talking about it day in and day out. And it's one of the things that you're going to be hearing more from Salesforce.com is that we think that we're going to be the web operating system. We're going to use our platform for that, and it's something that I think you'll be hearing more about. Eleanor talked about some of the business benefits that came along with cloud computing, the security aspects and the network latency capabilities, and he talked about the end-to-end transaction. So in the client-server world, he's very right. People are so used to seeing something, especially if you've got a server right next door to you and you've got a high bandwidth connection, and you may see something very quickly, but the whole transaction, take a look at the amount of data that you're getting back and the amount of time you're spending on the entire transaction. And what he spoke about was, getting more information with really less data entry, out of his implementation, and that was something that was very, very important to him and his organization. And he also spoke about the ease of making changes as you go forward. And both Karen and Eleanor have taken advantage of what we call a sandbox. If you haven't heard that terminology yet, it's like a practice platform that you can go in and practice your changes and practice your modifications on before you put them into production. And if you've listened to some of the other sessions in the keynotes, we are, as Eleanor pointed out, Salesforce is really very committed to making that, going from that testing environment, from that practice environment to production, a much easier process. And so you're going to hear some more about that, and I think it's something that's very, very, very exciting for me, because when I talk to customers. The other thing that Eleanor talked about was and I think this is important in any organization, is this kind of thinking about the change process, and it's very important. I mean, especially going to cloud computing and Service Cloud, it's something that people are maybe unsure about, and it's a little bit different, and so spending a little bit of time kind of helping them along, and as you learn about it, using your experiences like both Eleanor and Karen did to help your users get over that initial kind of concern about, oh my goodness, it's a new system, it's a new way of doing things, and where's the computer, and I don't understand. And it's okay, and they get it after a while, and in our experiences, they really embrace it. At this point, I'd like to take some questions. If there's, please, anybody that wants to, if you could, can you stand up to the microphone?
I have a question relative to the ramp-up time. You had mentioned that, Eleanor, that there was you took a hit in productivity for a period of time. Can you speak to how many agents you have and how long, what that length of time was on that hit for productivity?
Sure. So a couple of points. One is the training aspect, and we found that the user interface, especially in our case, because we had users who were already trained in those processes. So really, they just needed to be trained on the interface. It's fairly simple. So approximately half a day of training was more than sufficient in all cases. So it wasn't like we had a massive training budget. We did not have to do that. Previously, we know in other projects they required a significantly more amount of money and time invested in training. They're actually now doing training over the web. They'll just do a WebEx, and so they brought the training costs down even further. In terms of implementation, total there's about 600 agents across multiple sites. And we went live, the initial release was about 50 people. And what we found was a couple of times, we had a couple of bad days and they would ramp it down to about 10 users. And then, understand what the issue was, fix it. One of the times it was network related, nothing to do with Salesforce, so that got resolved. Other time we did tweak Salesforce and then push out a new release. And once we got through that initial bump, where we were really managing it on a day-to-day basis, the ramp up went up significantly faster. And within a 3 to 4 week period, everybody was on there. Now, in terms of how they decided how many people were on the new platform or not, those of you who are familiar with call centers, they are always measured by their service time, right? And so what happened was the business, and this has nothing to do with the technology piece, right? The business themselves decided that they were willing during the initial ramp-up period to take a hit on their business times of X, right? And so as long as they stayed within that parameter of X, they would essentially keep moving more and more agents onto the new platform. If the service level dropped for whatever reason, and remember this is a large national operational environment, so you could have a snowstorm happening on the East Coast that is generating a spike in service calls, nothing to do with the technology or the platform, but just because of the volume of service calls coming in that day, they would have to ramp down, right, just to be able to handle and manage those calls. So there's a lot of factors, and so the way they managed around it was they put together a business metric to say as long as our service levels don't fall below a certain threshold, we will continue to migrate people to the new platform. But within 4 weeks, everybody was migrated. Yeah.
Next, please.
Good morning. How you doing? We just went live about 2 weeks ago. And so in this, I've heard you both talk about iterations, you talked about system growth. When you do that, you do your initial training, but over time, you're adding value to the system. How are you getting your best practices out to the customer or out to your users? How are you getting the new versions, your roadmap? How is all that getting communicated out to the users?
Thanks. So pretty much every other week we decide that that's the day, that's our quietest day. And it's very, not very advanced. So everyone has an email in their box. We give them like 20 minutes before they get on the phones to go through their emails, and they don't really get that many emails. We try to restrict call center folks from most of the stuff that goes on that's policy driven and things like that. So there's an email that says this is the new change, and then we give them time later in the day to train a WebEx or more likely an online training. They take the survey, do you understand, click, 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 click. And then we roll it out the following Sunday for Monday. And so when they come in Monday, that change is in, and then the call center supervisor goes around and says, how's it going? Do you understand? What are your questions? And pretty quickly, within an hour, she has a list of things that almost worked. It almost worked, but it didn't quite. And then we just fix it and just keep it in operation.
Eleanor, is your experience maybe different in a larger?
Yeah, ours is slightly different because their call centers operate in a union environment, so it's a unionized workforce. So typically the rollouts are a bit more structured, and again, it's more to do with the business side than the technology. So the enablement from the technology is there, but they do need to follow certain processes. So typically what they do is, we found on average, we roll out an update, could be something small or something a bit more significant, approximately once a month, unless it's something very significant that they need in a very timely manner because of some business imperative or something's not working correctly. We'll pretty much roll it out once a month. Typically the way we do it is we roll it out over the weekend, so it's there Monday morning. Prior to that, they just do a WebEx session in shifts. If it's a big change, then they do schedule training for a couple of hours. In a couple of cases, they did get the employees to come in on a Saturday. So the training took place on a Saturday and they were live on Monday. But beyond that, training has not been a big barrier. The platform is pretty self-explanatory. It's a browser-based interface, so it's been okay.
Go ahead.
Karen, this question is for you. Actually, I have two questions. You said that the lawyers, you give them logins to it. Why do you have them do that instead of develop it on a customer portal and do it that way?
There's the way we have our account structure set up is very secure, so what they're able to see is the data that they're allowed to see anyway. So it hasn't really been a problem that we've needed to do anything other than just have them go online at their own computers, see the accounts that they have the rights to, and then go ahead and update them. Is there a better way?
Yeah. I'm just curious. And the other question, I mean, those users that you were saying that log in 15, 20 minutes a week.
Yeah.
Have you thought about a way to put that through a customer portal to internal people?
We've thought about lots of different ways to do that, and we haven't yet come up with a really good solution, because some of those people need, you don't know what you need until you get into the system and you find out a piece of data, which then leads you to 6 different sources that you wouldn't think you have to publish. But we do need to come up with a cheaper way to get those people into the system and be able to update data and inquire on the data without actually going into the system. So again, if you have a better way and you know somebody in Iowa working in a basement that wants to set it up for us.
Go ahead.
I probably have a list of questions for Eleanor, but I won't pester everybody with those. Pamela, welcome to IT. Or, excuse me, Karen, welcome to IT. You've navigated it well. I'm not asking any proprietary information or more just your expectations. You mentioned that consulting was expensive.
Yes.
Can you provide a range of what's expensive to you and what's reasonable?
We pay an average of $200 to $300 an hour, so I find that to be expensive. I don't know if anyone else doesn't, but we would not normally pay that for this type of service.
Yeah, that sounds very expensive.
Okay.
And reasonable?
Yeah, and we use Salesforce a lot.
What's reasonable?
What's reasonable? 75 to 100.
I'd like Eleanor to kind of respond to
Yeah,
being in the consulting business. Maybe you can add some color to that.
How much are you willing to pay? It's honestly, it's very hard in being in the consulting business to tack on a value, right, on what the rate should be. To a large extent, rates are determined by market forces. You have to be competitive.
But you didn't give a safe harbor speech yet.
And so in our case, we operate slightly differently because with a couple of our large customers, we have actually bulk buying deals, so the rates to them are very favorable. And precisely actually because of that, it probably works negatively when we bring in expertise from outside, as we had to in this project, because we were learning Salesforce on our own within our organization, and we had to tool up our own staff that we now have and we're able to use. No question, customers, when they compare it to the bulk rate they have and what we have to pay, our experience was probably similar but not as much, probably just slightly cheaper, I would say, without giving out any proprietary information. But having said that, it is dependent on the market forces. But again, there's a lot of choice out there. What we found is that, generally if you go with the larger established organizations, you pay higher rates.
Yeah.
The guy in the basement probably can do it for $75 an hour. So that's kind of how it works out.
Thank you. Next.
So I have 2 questions. The first question for Eleanor. We're looking at implementing, really relying on services, a lot of the asynchronization integration. And you seem to, at least in your points, hint that you had, performance issues or some of the questions and moving more to a batch process. Maybe you could speak a little more to the exact challenges that you had, maybe prevent us from going down that path.
Okay, so we can probably take some more detailed discussion offline, but what I'd like to say is there are asynchronous process capabilities within the platform. So I want to be clear about that. They do exist in the platform. They didn't work for us though. We needed it at probably a more enterprise level functionality, and we found that it didn't work for us. So what we did to solve that problem was we essentially would pull the data that we needed to deal with in batch format or via batch back down into our middleware or middle layer, and then we had to write custom code to deal with it from that point. Ideally, we would have liked it to not do that, because if the asynchronous process would have worked to the extent that we wanted it to work, then we would have just been able to call out into our services layer and have it execute the transaction. I know, though, we have had several discussions with Salesforce on this topic, and this is definitely on the radar screen. I don't believe it's an issue for everybody. I think it just didn't work with what we wanted to do. So, you know, the messaging queue is there, it works. You need to figure out if it works for you.
Okay.
Yeah, based on what you want to do.
And the second question for both of you, I think, Karen, you mentioned talking about Sandbox. Could you speak to, and all of us that are looking at implementing Salesforce, we go through the process of trying to go through the licensing process of how many users do you need the Sandbox, et cetera. I'm curious to know the differences that you found from what you were expecting to use from a licensing or user perspective to, at the end, what you ended up, you know, things that you had to add or change.
We ended up with a lot more licenses than we expected, but it was our own need for it due to security. So once we got underneath the covers and figured out how the security worked, we figured out that we wanted certain people to have different roles than others, and we thought we could group them the same. And so, you know, we have people who might have 3 responsibilities, 3 different roles. And so when we ended up building it out very quickly, we learned that we needed to get about an additional 150 licenses to meet those security requirements. But that wasn't Salesforce's fault. I mean, that was
How your business works.
That's how the business works.
Right.
I just wanted to add to that. In our case, the roles to user mapping worked really well. But I think one of the questions that I think will help you if I answer it is, all the API calls and the integration processes that you run, the batch processes that you run, what we figured out as we went through the project, each one of those requires a user license.
Right.
Right? So that's, you know, initially when you're buying, you're just kind of saying, okay, I need 100 for my users, and you don't really think about that. But in fact, any kind of interaction that you have with Salesforce, whether it's batch, it's in the back end, it's asynchronous through web service, all of those need user credential. So they do need a user ID. In our case, we ended up deploying from a scalability perspective, because, you know, each one has a fixed amount of resources that are available. So in the environment that we are, we've now gone up to about 30 user licenses that are being used specifically just to operate all the processes in the background.
Yeah, we have
no real users on top of that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
For that.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and so I'm going to have to cut the questions off. But I'm going to ask Karen and Eleanor if there are other questions and you'd like to speak with them. We can certainly take it out in the hallway, and I know that there's a couple of you that might have some. But please, I would appreciate if you would, and also would have a chance of winning an iPod Nano if you go ahead and take a survey out on the show floor and let us know how we did. We appreciate your feedback, and thank you for your time today.